Hello, Edward here from Zero88. In this session we're going to be talking about the remote apps that you can connect to your console running the ZerOS software. So that includes the Flex range of lighting consoles, the Flex and the Flex S consoles too. So first of all, what apps are there available? So there are two apps, both of which are available for iOS and Android. So you've got two apps available on both platforms, and you've got the remote app, which is going to look a little bit like this. And you then also have the monitor app, which is going to look a little bit like that. Two apps that are available on both platforms. So the remote app, that is your primary method of remotely controlling the console, and it's primarily designed for phones. And so you can go on there, and as you can see, we have our syntax pad that we can go in and start to type commands to control our console. But we can then use the chooser at the bottom of your phone screen, and that then allows you to access multiple other windows remotely as well. I can go and access my playback faders, I can go and access my colour window, and so you can go in and view various different windows to allow you to remotely control your console. Then over to the monitor app. This is mainly designed for tablets. And it allows you to view desktops of your console. So on the Flex range consoles, you have 4 desktop. You have your cues, you have your faders, you then have your palettes, and then you have an additional groups, effects, and colours desktop. And so you can view any of those desktops, any of those 4 desktops, on your tablet. If you have multiple tablets, you could therefore start to have multiple external desktops viewed at once if you wish. Although the Flex S24 doesn't have an external monitor output, you can still connect and use the monitor app. So you can use the monitor app to add an additional external monitor to your Flex or Flex S48, and you can also add and gain access to an external monitor on your Flex S24 using the ZerOS monitor app. So that's the two apps that are available, the remote and the monitor. The monitor is mainly designed just as a remote desktop, essentially. If you want to control the console, that would mainly be done from the remote app. So let's talk a little bit about how we could connect these together. I'm going to go and minimise that. So the simplest setup that you could have would be 3 devices connected. And they would consist of your console, a wireless router, and your remote device, your phone or your tablet. And so the way that would work is your console and your wireless router, they would be connected together by using a single Ethernet cable. So on the rear of your console, you've got a network port, and you would be able to plug a standard network cable linking your console and one of the network ports of your router. So just a single cable linking the two. That wireless router is then going to have a Wi-Fi network that you'll be able to connect to remotely. So on your device, whether that be iOS or Android, you can go to your Wi-Fi settings and you'll be able to see your wireless router's Wi-Fi network. You'll be able to connect to that, put in the password of your wireless router. Usually the default one of those is displayed on the bottom of your router. And you will then be able to connect to that network. Once you're connected to your console's network, you're then going to need to get the apps. And so as I said, there's the ZerOS Remote and ZerOS Monitor app available for both Android and iOS. And so you can go on that app and you're then going to give the ability to connect to your console. Before we do that, we're going to need to take a look at some settings that we have on our console. So to do that, we can go into Setup. Press your Setup key on the console, and you can then go to Devices from the left-hand side. And the first option in here is the Remote App Settings. And so first of all, you can go ahead and enable the remote apps. By default, it will be disabled. The next option we have is Security. So by default, there will be a password for ZerOS consoles, password being ZerOS, Z-E-R-O-S, but you can customize that password to be whatever you want. And now it's your choice of whether you use a password or not. In our really simple example that I've described there, where it's just literally our console and our router, and then we're using our phone to connect to that router, well, you've already got the password of the router itself. So you've already got a layer of security, if you like. So in those cases, you might choose to remove the password and not worry with a security password. If you're using your console as part of a larger lighting network, where there's multiple other users that have got access to the network, you might want to think about coming up with your own password that you know and you can then type into the remote device. So once you've enabled it, once you've decided on whether you want to have your own password for your console's remote connection, we can then talk a little bit about our network settings. So we're then going to need to configure the IP address of our console. Now you'll see here I've got it set to something called DHCP. And if you've got our simple network that we've described, you could go ahead and use that and everything's going to work for you. Now the reason for that is your router has something called a DHCP server built into it. Sounds complicated, but all it means is that your router can assign any connected devices, whether it be via the Ethernet cable or indeed wirelessly to your device. It will assign your device network settings. So it will assign the console network settings and it will assign your device network settings. And that means you don't need to do any configuration. You don't need to configure the network settings on your device. Once you connect, you're done in the settings. And equally on the console, set it to DHCP and the console will then be managed by your router. So that's what the DHCP option is. So if you're using our simple setup as I've described, you can go ahead and use DHCP for that. We'll explain a little bit further about what our static IP address is later. Now if I disconnect, you will see any available consoles listed in your app. So if you go into your app on your device, you will see any consoles that are available listed on the screen. So just like I can see on my laptop here, I can see a couple of devices in my app. And you can click on that device to connect, and if there's you've enabled a password, you can then put that in. Now by default, the name that you'll see here will be the console type and then its serial number. But you can customize that. So if you wish to rename the console, you can go ahead and go into setup and then go into settings. And within settings, you've got a desk name. So if you have got multiple consoles on your network, and so you're starting to build part of a larger remote network, maybe you've got multiple consoles on there, you could obviously give each one a custom name. So I might want to call this one something like front of house flex. And when I've done that, I can then see that name displayed in my remote connection. And so I can have lots of consoles listed and I can see which one is which. Now, in terms of what I'm running here on my screen, I am running the Windows version of the software, ZerOS Monitor. Now the Windows version gives you a little bit more flexibility because the Windows version of the app supports keyboard shortcuts. If you go on our website, there's a big list of all of the keyboard shortcuts that are available. So the ZerOS Monitor for Windows acts a little bit like a remote and a monitor. It allows me to remotely control the console anywhere that you've got a connection to your console remotely. So, you could have a laptop side of stage that's remotely connected to your console that's maybe front of house and you'll be able to then remotely control it. So I'm mentioning here, okay, well, we can start to scale this network. Let's take a look at some quick examples that we've got available to us. So we've got a really simple example here. This is another way that we could use the Windows app. So in this example here, I've got my Flex S48 console. Could be any console running ZerOS. And I've then got a single Ethernet cable coming straight from the console, straight into my laptop. So rather than actually going via a router, in my example here, I'm going straight from my laptop to my console. And essentially that's giving me my external monitor, an additional external monitor. But also, if that was a long Ethernet cable, it means that I could remotely program my console if I wanted to. Now, because we haven't got this wireless router that we've mentioned, it means that this DHCP option that we said about, where the router can automatically assign devices their network settings, well, we don't have that. So if we were using this example here, we'd have to manually assign some IP addresses. We'd have to use a static IP address, which was this option here. The static IP address option. We'll talk about that later. But just so you're aware, if you're going straight from laptop to console, you won't be able to use DHCP. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Let's take a look at another example though. And this time we're starting to see that we're starting to build this network up. So my example here, I've got a Flex S24. And then I've got my box here, that is my wireless router. So I've introduced my wireless router. But taking that a step further, I've got an Ethernet connection from console to router, but then I've got some Ethernet connections going to some laptops as well. Maybe I've got one of those in kind of a central tech office maybe. And then maybe one of those is side of stage or next to me acting as a wireless, as a external monitor. Of course, on the laptop, it could be via Ethernet or it could be over Wi-Fi. So I could actually break that cable if I wanted to, and actually I could connect my laptop to the network wirelessly. I've then got my iPad and I've got my smartphones also connected to the network as well. So all of them can be remoting into the console. Let's take a look at another example. And this example is all about the ability to add external desktops, to view your desktops, to view multiple desktops at once. So in this case, I've got a full-size Flex I'm looking at here. And I can see above it, that's my external monitor connected. But then next to me, I've got a laptop that I can use to view an additional external desktop. Taking that a step further, because again, I'm using a wireless router, I'm able to add an iPad to the network, so I can have that for an additional screen. I've also got some smartphones connected wirelessly as well, but where this starts to get a more scalable system is I've also got a Ethernet gateway. So in this example, I'm also, as well as my remote connection going over the network, I've also got some DMX over Ethernet on my network as well. And that might be going to an Ethernet 8 or a Gateway 8, any device that can convert our Ethernet back to DMX. And I could have that device on my network as well. So you can start to have multiple different things, different languages, if you like, being spoken over your network. And let's explain a little bit about how we can start to configure our network. So every device that sits on a network is going to need an IP address. IP standing for Internet Protocol. And there are billions of addresses available. So we don't need to worry. We're not going to run out. We're talking here about IPv4. There's also a version called IPv6. But for our lighting networks here, we're just talking about IPv4. IP addresses are represented by 4 numbers. And those are numbers, each of those numbers is between 0 and 255. So if I go on my console, and I'm going to go and enable a static IP address, because I do this, it's going to temporarily break my remote connection because I've changed network settings. So I'm just going to disconnect and then reconnect. And you'll see if I choose static, I then get an IP address option here. That's what we're talking about. And as you can see, there's a very typical IP address here, 192.168.0.something. Very typical IP address you're going to see. And so that's what we can see here. We've got something, dot something, dot something, dot something. And these numbers that are separated by dots, we refer to those as octets. That's what we would refer to each part of that IP. As we've already seen, these IP addresses can either be static or dynamic. By dynamic, we're referring to DHCP. Or they can be static, which basically means that we define them ourselves. So rather than a device on the network assigning the other devices their network settings, if we're talking about static, we're the ones that are assigning those devices their network settings. Now, an IP address is split into two parts. An IP address is split into a network number, network address, and also the host address. Now, the way the IP address is split into those two parts is a subnet mask. And you'll see on your console settings that as soon as you have static, you have an IP option and also a subnet mask option as well. Those sit hand in hand, and they are really important because they are kind of intrinsically linked to how they work. So the subnet mask allows you to split your devices onto sub-networks, essentially. And a subnet is also represented by our 4 octets separated by dots. And again, those are going to be numbers between 0 and 255. Now, for the purpose of this session, we're going to keep this simple because we're going to say that in a subnet, those values are either a 0 or a 255. We're going to keep things simple and just say, that a subnet is either a 0 or a 255 in our octets here. How does it limit? And how does it break up our network into subnetworks? Well, let's take a look at some examples. In my little table here, let's say that the first row, that is device number 1. So maybe in our example that we saw here, of our console and our laptop together, let's say that this is our console at the top, and then this is our laptop. As we've said, because we haven't got a router to do the job for us, we need to set these IP addresses manually. So on the console, I would go in and choose static IP address to give me access to my IP and my subnet options. And so, let's say that I've got the IP address of my console set to 192.168.110. IP addresses will then also have a subnet mask. And let's say that in my case here, I'm using a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. Now here comes the bit to be aware of. And again, as I've said, I'm keeping this simple. If there is a 255 in the first octet of your subnet, that means the first octet of the IP addresses of your devices that you wish to talk to each other must match. So if I want device 1 and device 2 to talk to each other, and they have a 255 in that same octet in their subnet, those two numbers must match. So yep, they both have a 192 and they both have a 255 in their subnet. Happy days, that's going to work. Again, on to the next octet, we've also got a 255. So any device, so if we want devices to talk, they must also have a matching second octet. So yep, both devices, 192.168. We're okay so far. So far so good, they're both matching. On to our third octet. We can now see in this example, our two devices can't talk. Because we've got a 255 again in our third octet, that means again that if we want these two devices to talk to each other, and they both have this subnet mask, we need this value to match. So if I were to go and set this to 1, there we go, we've solved the problem. We can now have our two devices talking to one another. And that's because if we have a 255, where the 255s are in our subnet, that is representing the network address. Now, if you remember, we go back to here, the IP is split into the network and the host. And that's what we're seeing here. If we've got a 255, 255, 255, that means the first 3 octets of our IP, that is the network number, if you like. So these devices are currently talking to each other on network number 192.168.1. Where we have a 0 in our subnet, that is then the host address. By host, we just mean device, unique device number. And so in this case here, we've got device number 10 and device number 20. And both of those are sat on this network number. Couple of things to be aware of. If I were to set this to 10 as well, that's not going to work. You can't have multiple devices with the same IP address. So our IP addresses must be unique. Equally, I could go and say 20 there. And if I were to have that on 2, well, at the moment, these two devices can't talk because we've got 255 here, meaning these two must match. But of course, I could set this to be 0. And now my devices can talk to each other because I've now got a 255 just in the first 2 octets, and therefore only the first 2 octets of the IP need to match, and the rest can be different. So in this case, I've moved where that separation between the network number and the host number lives, because now my network number is just 192.168, and device 1's number is 110, and my second device's number is 220, and both of them can talk to each other. As we mentioned, these numbers are numbers between 0 and 255. Just worth bearing in mind, the last octet in your IP should not be a 255. That can have a maximum of 254. The reason for that is 255 is reserved. So I could have 254, I could have that set to 255. These devices are going to be able to talk to each other fine using these settings here. If you've got any questions with IP addressing, do please just drop us an email and we can help you out. Now, talking of helping you out, that brings us very nicely onto our DHCP server. And we've been talking about this DHCP server a little bit throughout this session. And this is where it really comes into its own. If you don't kind of want to understand the IP addressing, if you can't get your head around that, the DHCP server will help you out. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and as we've said, it automatically manages the IP addresses, subnet, and other settings of all of the devices on the network. And so it means you don't need to worry about what settings you give to your console, to your console, or any devices indeed that are on the network. If we go into our console and we do indeed set it to DHCP, I'm now going to disconnect and reconnect. You'll see here, DHCP, you don't get any information. If you want to find what IP address your console has been assigned by the DHCP server, exit setup, and you can then just go and hit a question mark, and that will open the system info window on your queues desktop. You can then go to network overview, and this will give you your DHCP information here, and so I can see that is the IP address my console has been assigned by the DHCP server. And so that's what we will see with our DHCP server. Just something to be aware of. If we do this setup here that we've mentioned, console and laptop connected straight to each other, we're going to need to configure the IP address on the console and on the laptop, as we've already mentioned, to make sure that they can talk. If we don't configure an IP address on the laptop, you're going to end up something that looks a bit like that. 169.254.something.something. If you ever see a device has that IP address, and you think, well, I didn't assign that, where's that coming from? That's what we call a link local address. And that means that if a device is set to DHCP, but it doesn't receive a DHCP address, doesn't receive an IP address from a DHCP server, it will automatically assign itself an IP in this range. So that's why if you see that an IP address of that kind of style, it means that that device has not received network settings from your DHCP server. Just one thing to mention while we're here. We're talking here about your own dedicated network, whether that be adding consoles together, adding in some wireless devices. We would recommend not connecting your console to a network with internet access. You'll see messages like this within your console's manual. It is best practice to make sure that your console is not connected to a network with internet access. Make sure that your console is on its dedicated lighting network. And that is everything that I wanted to go through today. So I hope you found that useful, and I hope you've kind of understood about how we can use these remote apps and the network settings required to get them up and running. We've looked at how DHCP can just make sure that everything is assigned its addresses, but then we've also looked at static IP addresses and how we can manually assign our IP addresses instead if we need to. So I hope you found that useful. If you've got any questions at all, please do drop us an email to support@zero88.com and we'll be able to help you out. Thank you very much for joining. Take care.